So by way of introduction, I actually want to tell you a quick story about the first time that I met Paul. I had just been hired as the CEO of SVP Tucson, and this was in December of 2015, and I was going to start in January of 2016. And I was invited to attend the SVP annual partner meeting where I was going to be introduced as the new CEO. And the speaker of that event was Paul Shoemaker. So here I am, I'm already feeling a little bit intimidated. I've just been hired for my first CEO gig. I'm about to meet this group of people that I'm going to be working very closely with, our social venture partners. I'm really hoping to make a good first impression. And I'm starting to feel a little bit relieved that I'm going to be able to meet someone who's been there, because amongst Paul's many accomplishments, he was the founding CEO of SVP International and held that position, I think, for 17 years. And so throughout this evening, he delivers this really uplifting and motivating speech about his first book, which is titled Can't Not Do. And as I learn more about Paul from everyone who's there and through my conversations with him, I found out all these different facts about him. He was named one of the 50 most influential people in the nonprofit sector by the Nonprofit Times. He was named Philanthropist of the Year by Future in Review. He is a highly sought after consultant in the areas of leadership development and business modeling and strategy. And if you've met him, you also know he's kind of a formidable figure. I just asked him, he's 6'1". He's close to a foot taller than me. So after this experience, I am feeling like I have these really giant shoes to fill. And I have to admit, I was feeling kind of intimidated. But since that time, Paul has become a dear friend. He's become a trusted colleague, and he's become a true supporter. And I am honored to serve on the Social Venture Partners International Board of Directors with him. And I find myself continually surprised with the things I learn about Paul. Just today, I was on a phone call with the CEO of a local tech company. And I mentioned that the highlight of my day was I get to interview Paul. And she responded with, "Oh my gosh, he's one of my tech heroes." And I thought, what? Like, he's a hero in the social change sector, and I knew he worked for Microsoft, but I just had no idea he's a tech hero. So again, every time I talk to Paul, I learn new things about him, but most importantly, I'd say I learn new insight that really influences me as a human and as a CEO. So we're here today to talk about his new book, Taking Charge of Change: How Rebuilders Solve Hard Problems. I've started reading it. I've started listening to his podcast, which you should all tune into and we'll share with you as well. And I think what strikes me the most is that Paul has a really important message to share with us about what types of leaders are going to be needed to solve the really big problems in our world and what that means for all of us. So I want to welcome you, Paul. Every time I'm with you, I have just a ton of fun, and I'm expecting the same to happen in this next hour together. And is there anything that you would like to add about kind of your background before we just jump into questions?
First of all, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for that's here tonight. Number one, I'm not going to add or change anything because that's as good as it gets. I'm just going to retire tomorrow because that was such an awesome introduction. Thank you. And by the way, anybody that wasn't there that night, when she came up after me, she absolutely killed it. So if she tells you anything differently, don't let her do that. You and I always have a ton of fun together. So nothing to add to it. I'm absolutely looking forward to the conversation. Every time I do this, and every place I do this in, not only do I get a chance to talk about it, I learn something from people. So I would really encourage everybody to be engaged and throw your questions in the chat and, you know, engage in the conversation with Sarah and I, because that's what it's about. I've learned something everywhere I talk so far. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And yes, please put your questions in the chat bar. We'll also just have a time where you can open up and share them with us. So I just want to start from the beginning and ask you, how did you get the idea for this book, Taking Charge of Change?
Yeah, it kind of goes in three phases. First, so I left SVP Seattle in 2015. I've been a private consultant the last 6 years. I've worked with a range of for-profit, nonprofit, and public sector companies, organizations on social impact causes, big organizations, small ones, just about every cause that's out there. And around 2018, I was sort of trying to do a little bit of reflection. And the reflection I started with was sort of what's going on in the world around me. And I assume, like a lot of us, we're familiar with this story about health disparities. We're familiar with another story about economic or wealth disparities. We're familiar with stories about educational gap. And what I had never done was taken all of those and put them all together, sort of in one picture. And I will say it was a wake-up call for me, to some degree, a wake-up call to my own ignorance. And it wasn't just the scope of inequities in America, it was also the trajectory. So this is a quick history lesson for 75 years. If you look at coming out of World War II, for 40 to 50 years, bumpy, choppy, but in general, on economic, social health indicators, there was collective progress towards equity. We were sort of climbing the mountain towards greater economic, social health equity. If you literally look at the numbers, the last 25 years, we're literally going the other way back down the mountain. It's kind of discouraging, but it's an important, honest picture to look at. So when folks look at 2020, go, oh my God, all the inequities that happened, which is true. This is not when the story of inequities has started. This has been going on for about a generation in America. And that's why all of us are here to do this work. So phase one was 2018 wake-up call. 2019, literally, my next step in this was, so what is working out there? What kinds of things are successful? What is effective? I was looking at programs and models and strategies and organizations, and I could never sort of get a clear focus. What kept coming through everything I looked at in that sort of research, with all kinds of Venn diagrams and spreadsheets and whiteboard markings, were leaders. This is not rocket science. We all know leaders matter. So the second thing that came clear to me was leaders. And what I spent time thinking about was, who's going to be the kind of leader that's ready to sort of respond to the times that are ahead? So that was 2019. I was started to write the book. Part 3 of the book started in about February 2020, as you might imagine. The world around us changed. It took it from a book that I was thinking about writing in 2018 to one I thought I should write in 2019. And in 2020, this was a have to write. I had some real strong convictions about what I started to believe in 2019. In 2020, just accelerated, accentuated, exacerbated everything I'd felt before then. So that's how I got here, and understanding myself of the degree and the pace and the trajectory of inequities, thinking about what kinds of leaders are we going to need, and then 2020, just putting a deep, hot, white spotlight on all of it.
Thank you for that, Paul. I love that you touched on all of the data and the graphs that are in this book. So for those of you who don't have a copy, the first portion of it really opens up with profiling all of these statistics. And for me, I mean, it was really eye-opening. I don't know that there was any single piece that I didn't necessarily know, but they were compiled in such a way that I felt like I had no idea what was actually happening in our world, and that I'd been blind to it. And it can feel really discouraging at first. And clearly, what I also appreciate is that you kind of lean into that and say, what's it going to take to get out of here?
Yep.
So then the book is really about these 5 leadership qualities that you've described. And I'd love for you just to kind of ground us in what are these 5 leadership traits that you define as rebuilders.
You got it. So I'll pick back up in sort of part 2 of that story. What I started trying to think about for myself, and one thing I'll state sort of up front, like I think Jim Collins and people like him are some of the best leadership writers of all time. A lot of work they do, which is really good work, is sort of retrospective look back. What can I reverse engineer out of what I've learned and seen happen? My book, I will acknowledge, it's prospective, it's future looking. It also means it's my opinion, it's subjective. I want to believe it's well-informed, and it's something I feel very passionate about. So when I was looking at the set of conditions we were in and thinking about the future. The other overlay that goes with all these inequities is just the range of complexities that we're dealing with as a nation right now. How siloed and divided we are, how media and technology sometimes divide us as much as unite us. These generational historic challenges like climate and geopolitical that we face. So we are full of a world of such complexity. And I was trying to say, given where we've come from and where we're going, what kinds of leaders are we going to need in the decade ahead? So I'm gonna share two visuals real quick. And that's the only time I'll sort of like, put something on the screen for you guys, but I want to share something with you guys. First one. So what I was searching for in 2019 was the intersection of three things. Some of the best leaders I'd worked with, what were their traits and attributes? Where did I see evidence of true social impact sort of in response to what I saw in 2018? And then what's it going to take to meet the challenges of the decade ahead? And that bottom circle, by the way, that's the one that took a lot of updating over the course of 2020, because a lot of things sort of shifted and changed. But that's metaphorically and literally, that's what I was looking for. And sort of the overlap of those three circles, those to me turned out, I didn't know it was going to be in the intersection there. What came out of there was, for me, what I think of and I call 5 vital traits. And those 5 vital traits, I'm going to give you an overview of them right here and a visual to sort of like stick with you. And I'll take that back down and then we can talk about them. It's about a generosity mindset, 24/7 authenticity, conviction, data conviction, the capacity for complexity, and then this sort of cross-sector fluency skill that ties a lot of these things together. So every one of those, I'll just tell you, is a trait that responds to a particular thing going on in our world right now. So for example, generosity mindset. The world we're living in, we're in a place like SVP, so I think we got a lot of people around here that are trying to sort of run the other direction. We all know the divisions and silos in America. We know how fractured we can be. It's a bigger challenge than it's been in decades and decades and decades. And we need people that are going to keep showing up with this generosity mindset. What can I get? How can I get the best from everyone? How can I get past the rivalries and the divisions? How can I keep my eyes on the prize, the end goal? How do I have a sense of bringing people together in a way that's going to enable us to make forward progress? So that is an example of, it's a trait that I think matters. It responds to something that's going on right now. I think it's also going to be critical in the decade ahead. So those are the 5 traits, CR, and that's sort of how I arrived at them. So I probably kind of killed 2 birds with 1 stone there. But if there's any visual folks should have in their head, it's sort of 3 circles and 5 traits.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the generosity mindset. I was having a conversation with my husband recently, and that I always kind of see the world positively. And I was referencing that it's because I do this work with social venture partners where there is this like abundance of generosity mindset, and that's my day in and day out, and it just influences, my perception of the world. I'm actually curious, when you were developing these and like doing your research and diving in, were there any traits that surprised you?
I'll say probably of all of them, and it actually reflects. So one of the things that I want people to do with this book is not just read it. I hope it'll make them think. And then I hope it'll actually motivate them to sort of like look at their own leadership skills for them as an individual, the team, their organization. So the reason I bring that up is when I look at myself, if I look at those 5 things, the one that surprised me and the thing I have the most work to do on is what I call capacity for complexity. Mm-hmm. And we, without a doubt, I think we have the most complex decade ahead of us that America's seen in at least 60, probably 80 years. Just the range of challenges that we've got. And so what that means is we need people, we need leaders that can absorb, take in a wide range of information. They can process it. They can keep their minds open to new ideas, and they can transmit it back out, and they can constantly process new information. I'm a pretty linear thinker. I like 1 or 2 things in front of me at one time. That ain't the way the world's always working right now. So if you want to ask me what surprised me, it was complexity, capacity. It's probably because it's a weakness and or a blind spot of mine to sort of think that way. And my adaptation to that, by the way, there's two things. One, if I'm a part of a team or a group, I consciously want to think, do I have people in the room that I think can think 3 and 4 dimensionally? Because I'm really good with 2D and I can stretch myself to 3D. I need some people who can get outside the box. The second comment I'll make, and I mean this sincerely, there's a section in that chapter in the book called "You Better Have Women in the Room." This is my opinion. Women leaders are better at complexity on average, not universally. I'm not saying that because I'm talking to Sierra. I'm not saying that because I'm trying to make my wife happy or anybody on this call. That has been my empirical experience the last 6 and 20 years. Women are just better at getting past diversions. They can keep their eyes on the prize better. They can deal with more things at one time than guys can. So my adaptations to complexity capacity are, number one, make sure I'm a part of a team that's got that at the table. And number two, make sure you got women in the room. And the last thing I'll say on that, Mark Benioff, who's the chairperson of Salesforce, who's a dude that's done pretty okay for himself the last 30 years. I've seen a quote for him that says, I don't want to do any more meetings anymore without at least a third of the people in the room being women. So that's the one that surprised me. And I think it surprised me because it's a weakness and a blind spot of mine.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I saw a bunch of smiles and thumbs up when you mentioned the importance of female leadership. So
I believe it.
Cheers.
Good.
So no, I appreciate that. And I know this group does. So thinking about that, like you just owned that you have a blind spot, and we all do. And so I'm really curious, are there traits that are innate versus those that can be learned, or, you know, how does that work and kind of break down?
That's always an interesting leadership question, period, right? Like, can we learn to be leaders, or is it innate? And we know we can all learn. So let's just start from that assumption. What I will say is this, and I make this sort of assertion in the book. Again, this is my point of view. I do think there are some of those traits that are more learnable than others. There's some of those traits that are a little bit more innate than others. So if I was going to put those 5 on a continuum, on one end, I would put this complexity capacity. I think that is the hardest one to teach and learn. And I'm a little bit of a test case here. When I think about how do I expand my ability to think outside the box, think 3D, 4D, et cetera, it's really going to stretch me beyond what my capability is. That's the one that I think is the most sort of innate. The other end of the spectrum is this trait I call cross-sector fluency. We can all intentionally decide that we want to be cross-sector. We can dive into each of those sectors enough to be cross-sector fluent, not episodically, not transactionally, but in a way that we really get deep in those sectors. And I think SVP is an awesome place that develops cross-sector fluent leaders. So that one is the most learnable. And then the other 3 is sort of put on the spectrum sort of in between there. But it's an opinion. It's one definitely based on my own experiences. I think complexity is hard to teach. It is teachable. I also don't, when I look around out there and I look at learning and development, I don't see as much out there about how to teach things like complexity capacity. I don't see as much about how to teach things like generosity mindset. I've got an MBA. None of those 5 traits I just described were in class a few years ago. There's probably a few of them that have sort of come into the curriculum since then. But I think the kinds of qualities and the kind of traits that we need in the future, they're very adaptive ones. There's a little more right brain than left brain. It's a lot more sort of subjective than objective. And I think we need to understand how to learn and teach all of these traits. I do think some of them are more innate than others, and that's my answer to it. Other folks might have a different opinion. That's just that's what I've found in my experiences. It's a great question.
Yeah. That's interesting that you called out the complexity capacity and the cross-sector fluency, because as I'm reading this book, and as you know, every day in SVP and my work might be different, and I'm thinking about the leadership attributes in different ways in different scenarios, but those are the 2 I keep coming back to when I think about the work that SVP has set out. So
Can I ask you a
SVP
question?
Tucson yeah, go ahead.
So when you're sort of like leading me into a question. When I think about SVP and I think about what I just said, for SVP Tucson, how do you see SVP working across sectors? So if I think that matters and it's important to solving complex problems, how do you think SVP Tucson either is or will or should be working across the private, the nonprofit, and the public sector? What do you see?
Yeah, no, I love that question. This is the work that's right in front of us. So just a tiny bit of background information, we have set what we're calling a community impact goal, and really deriving our work to accomplish community level change. And so when you talk about complex problems, and we're approaching this work from the area of poverty elimination, educational attainment, all those driving forces, it's a very complex problem that must be solved across sectors. And so while our work historically has been almost entirely rooted in the nonprofit sector, I would say the exceptions to that are because our partners are coming in from various sectors, they're bringing influence and ideas and connections in, but we haven't really had the intentionality of solving a problem across sectors. So it's a 2-generation community impact goal, really tying together kind of whole family solutions around children and educational attainment and adults and workforce development, increasing their income. And so we are pulling together a coalition of people across sectors to really be working on these solutions. And it's been interesting as we have this conversation. I mean, government's clearly interested in this. Corporations are clearly interested in this. So I would say that we're at the beginning stages of really diving into this in a new way. And I'm really feeling the need and taking the opportunities to learn more about how these other sectors work, because so much of my background has been in the nonprofit sector.
Yep, fascinating question. And there's no doubt that if you're going to take that on as an organization and as individuals in the organization, that is a muscle that you all are going to need to build, because I can't think of any problems anymore. They're going to get solved one sector at a time. And again, 2020 was the lightning rod for that. There are so many ways in which the private sector sort of went from, we're interested, to, no, we're in the mosh pit. And they got to be in the mosh pit. And by the way, not just because it's a good thing to do, actually their business success and their bottom line depends on them being a lot more cross-sector fluent than they ever had to be before.
Yeah. No, that actually makes me think of, we just had our fast pitch event, which is the culmination of kind of our fast pitch training program. And to see the way that Tucson businesses and corporations stood up in this time, we more than quadrupled the amount of money that went up through that stage.
Wow.
Because of, like you said, corporations are really interested in the solutions, and they recognize the way they've been investing in social change hasn't been working. And so they're looking for new and innovative solutions. And so there's a number of ways that I'm seeing this happen in real time here in SVP Tucson. So the other one that I think about a lot, and I'd love to just have you talk a little bit more about, is this complexity capacity. And I don't know how I feel about, you said it being the hardest to learn. I don't know where I fall on that spectrum, but I do know that the challenges that I'm tasked with helping to develop solutions for are incredibly complex. And I'm curious what your advice is to an organization that's really looking to tackle these large, complex problems.
Yep. So let me answer that in 2 ways. One way is I'll sort of give you an answer, and then the other thing I'll do is I'll give you a couple examples of it. So I said this a minute ago. One of the ways that I hope people, and I'm in the process of finishing up a discussion and a resource guide that I thought would be done by now, but of course it's not, but it will be done in a few days. And I'll send that out to everybody to go alongside the book. I want people to use that framework to think about not just themselves, but think of the organizations they're a part of. And it's going to take some objective thinking. It's going to take some self-analysis. But to understand, do I have everybody in the room that I need, either literally or metaphorically, to work on solve a hard problem? It absolutely starts with cross-sector. It continues with cross-ethnic, cross-race, cross-diversity. We cannot solve these problems anymore in a simple way. We don't have any 2-dimensional problems left. I'm not even sure we got 3-dimensional problems left. They're just complex. So that's kind of an objective answer. And then the other way to answer it, Sarah, is to give you a couple examples of people in the book. One person that I wrote about in the book, and I didn't even think about it until right before we came on the call. is the woman that's the CEO of SVPI, Sudha Nandagopal. Some of you've met her, some of you've heard about her. One of the reasons I sort of tagged her up for complexity capacity is she has this amazing ability to, in the book, what I described is she's a great flag waver. She's also a great bridge builder. So when we think about causes and challenges we work on in a community, we need both. We need people that are flag wavers that believe in the cause. They're going to lead the charge. They're going to, bang down the walls. They're going to, ruffle some feathers. They're going to rattle people's cages. We got to have those. We also need bridge builders, right? People can sort of translate from the status quo or translate from the current time to the future. If we only have sort of like the status quo and flag wavers, like they're like two islands, if you will. We need people that are bridge builders. And I think a lot of times, by the way, SVP EDs and SVP partners play that kind of role. They can bridge between those two. I definitely think of myself as a bridge builder. And it's a particular role that needs to get filled. And the reason why I've got Sudha in the book is because she's brilliant at both. And you don't find many people that can sort of wear both of those hats. And I watch her do that in a meeting. I watch her sort of lead the charge and make the case and, bang the table. And then 5 minutes later, she sees the 5 people that are not in the game, and she's bringing them to the table. And a lot of people don't have that ability to sort of like look at things from both those lenses, but she does. That's an example. Another person that's in the book, her name is Dreama Gentry. She works for an organization called the Berea Educational Partnership in rural Kentucky. And by the way, one of the things I tried to make sure I did in this book, it was pretty organic, but there was some intention to it too, was I didn't just talk to CXOs at the head of big organizations. I talked to a gender mix. I talked to people in big organizations, small ones. I talked to urban people, rural people. I talked to folks that are like literally community leaders on the street, on the ground, as well as and head of organizations. Dream is a great example of, she works in rural Kentucky. That's where she grew up. That's where she does her work. That's where she's going to be. That's what she's committed to. And her complexity capacity is her ability in that kind of situation. She's got to wear so many hats. We live in urban areas and we get used to sort of like grabbing this resource and that person, et cetera. And it's not like the internet doesn't allow us to sort of access anybody, but when she's working real time on the ground in Kentucky.
Hold on a second. Oh, okay, continue, Paul.
That's good. She's got to be able to sort of bridge a lot of different people, a lot of different talents, and a lot of different sorts of assets to bring to the equation. She's got to make a lot out of not having a whole lot. So those are sort of two examples of people that I think are really good at complexity capacity, different context, different situation, different reasons. And yet they're both vital to a solution if we're going to try to make progress on those inequities that I talked about at the start of our conversation.
I so appreciate the two different stories or profiles. And as I mentioned earlier, I have the joy of serving on the SVP International Board with Paul, so I get a chance to work with Sudha. And I have to say, I've witnessed exactly what you're talking about. And one of the things I recognized when I stepped into this role is that I would be surrounding myself with people who are smarter than myself, more experienced than myself, and to really use this as an opportunity to just lean in and learn. And she is one of those people that I really like to lean in and learn from.
Yep.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it is a pretty sophisticated level of leadership. The comment I just made to you, it took me a handful of times of being in meetings with her and just sort of like watching her operate. And I was trying to put my head like, how does she do that? What's she doing? And there was the meeting we had at the Gates Foundation about a year ago, just finally hit me. It was the last in-person one we did. I just watched her like work the room, not in a manipulative way, but just being cognizant of like, when do I need to bang the table and when do I need to bring the room together? And usually it's different people doing that. She's able to do that, pivot on that self in her own mind, sort of real time, better than just about anyone I've seen.
Yeah, no, that was a powerful meeting. And what I'm wondering about now is, clearly these leadership traits are applicable in all sectors, but I'd love to talk for a moment about just philanthropy in general and what trends you're seeing, because I know you hold a unique seat where you're seeing a lot. And I'd love for you to share what you see from that vantage point.
Absolutely. So in general, the last couple of years, especially 2020, has actually, it's hard to call a lot of things silver linings in 2020, but have been some silver linings. And actually one of the places where there's been some progress, I think, is on philanthropic practice and behavior. Back in last March, April, an awful lot of philanthropic institutions said, we're going to change the way we're doing business for COVID. We're going to loosen up the restrictions on our grants. We're going to lessen the paperwork. We're going to be more responsive and work faster with you. We're going to talk to our grantees more. All good things. And oh, by the way, a year later, don't stop doing those things. So I think one set of practices that's evolved in the last year is the relationship between funders and grantees. And again, being sort of a little biased and selfish, I think some of these things are things that SVP believes in. And we've sort of been on the leading edge of it. And I see more folks sort of coming along in that way now. So one of them is the way that a funder works with a grantee. Another way is we beat the drum for 20 years on this notion of restricted or unrestricted funding, not unaccountable funding, tying it to outcomes, but allowing and enabling organizations, just like a private sector company does, to decide the best way to spend their money to reach an end goal. In the private sector, it's this clean thing called profit. In the social and public sectors, it's this unclean, hard to define thing called social change. So I've definitely also seen more funders change their practice on that one. The last one I would say is, I'm trying to remember who I first heard this expression from, but somebody once said to me, we can't do this work to communities, we have to do that with them. And the first time I heard it, I thought it was kind of hyperbole. I didn't see a lot of that in practice. That was probably, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. I'd say particularly in the last 3 years, accelerated by 2020, but it's been happening before then. More people are bringing the community to the table, and not just the table to sit there and observe, but literally to be at the table. In the book, there's a woman by the name of Erica Valiant. She's on around page 70, 80. She's a phenomenal example of this. It's bringing community voice to the table. I think every one of those things we have made real progress on, and I don't think we're going to go, we might, shift around a little bit. I don't think we're going backwards, especially on community voice. I think people understand this has to be not just a partnership across sectors, it has to be a partnership across layers of communities and kinds of people in communities. I know the work you guys are doing. I'll put a question back on you again. One of the ways of thinking of community voice is making sure that people with lived experience is at the table. And I'm in Seattle, by the way, and along with San Francisco and a few countries, cities on the West Coast, we feel homelessness in an intense way right now. And we're not going to solve that problem without people with lived experience at the table. How does that play out for SVP Tucson? Is community voice and lived experience, is that something you guys are playing with? How does that play into your guys' work?
Yeah, great question. So it's certainly a piece of the SVP kind of values. And what I think about a lot right now is over the past couple of years, we've made a bunch of organizational shifts. I mentioned our 2-gen goal. We made a bunch of shifts in fast pitch this past year, but all of that was informed by listening to community voice.
Yep.
So going out into the community and talking to the nonprofits who are doing the work, and then talking to the people who are impacted by this, who are having the real lived experiences. And I can say without a doubt that the solutions that we're bringing forward, they're not our ideas, we're the vessel for them, but they're the ideas that are generated in those spaces that we're supporting and funding and bringing structure to. And I think that's a recent shift, in our work over the past couple of years. And then the other thing I think about specific to fast pitch is we made a number of changes in that program, but we had 10 nonprofit leaders in this past year's program. And we really changed the criteria and we changed the application process so that it was centering community voice, and it was centering leaders who are really proximate to the problems. And we did this without knowing what the results would be. I was so excited. I mean, 7 of the 10 people who participated were people of color. the majority of them had lived the experience of the work they were sharing. And that's the way it should be. And so I think we just need to continue to do that work. And oftentimes that means decentering ourselves and our ideas,
Yep.
Or meeting people in the middle and having those conversations. So it's a somewhat new approach to the work, but it's one we've fully embraced over these past 2 years.
It's messier, it's harder, and it's also the only way that I think real change is going to happen.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. And certainly who would know the answers more than the people who are living the experience. So
I would. Yep, correct. Exactly right.
So I'm mindful of the time here, and it's important. I just realized I should have opened up to audience questions earlier. So I want to kick us off. I see that Pam Grissom had a question in the chat bar. Pam, do you want to take yourself on mute and ask it, or do you want us to do that?
Well, you were talking about the 5.
Oh yeah, I dropped my phone.
Oh, I hate when I do that.
Right, but thank you.
What can be learned? And I feel like authenticity and generosity, you were talking about the one thing that you thought was innate was the ability for complexity. I remember in my youth taking a management, who was the guy in the management, everybody in the old days took this management class. And a friend of mine kept saying, how do you teach somebody how to be authentic and not come across like a salesperson? So it seems to me that those are very innate qualities that you can't learn. What do you think?
Great point. I'll acknowledge your point and somewhat disagree with you. And tactical answer, first of all, that's part of why I'm putting together a discussion resource guide to give people sort of avenues, Pam, to access this kind of education. I'm trying to partner with a couple of learning and development companies and mapping those traits to particular sort of skill building modules and classes and resources they have. So that's a very tactical answer to your question. The sort of higher level answer I would give you is in both of those. Number one, the book's got 8 examples of it. I do think we learn from role models. I think there are some phenomenal role models in that book. I'll just say a couple things about each of them. When it comes to authenticity, there's a couple of traits there's a couple of sort of qualities, if you will, that I think every one of those people had, or most of those people had. Every one of them had a set of guiding principles. And I didn't have to like drag it out of them. Like it was like second nature to them. So I'll say about myself, for example, one way I can increase my authenticity is I can make sure that I'm living my life according to a set of intentional guiding principles. I don't think I'm an inauthentic person. I think I can build that muscle by being more intentional about what are the principles sort of guide how I run and live my life. One of my there's a guy in that section called Michael McAfee. He is a phenomenally powerful leader. He's an African-American man that came out of a low-income community in Oakland. The guy is world-class. One of his core values is he wants to get close to wealth and power and never wants to let it change him. And that absolutely guides how that guy thinks about stuff. So I think there's also a level of intention about authenticity, Pam. Every one of these things is a little bit like going to the gym and, you know, I can do a bench press and I can do a military press and I can do a leg curl. Every one of these builds our muscle a little bit more. So that's a couple thoughts on authenticity. On generosity, I'll say on this one, there's examples in the book. On the podcast that I did, I think it's episode 8, there's a woman by the name of Cecilia Gutierrez. She is she could teach a master class on this. And on that one, what I'll say you can do intentionally, it's when I say mindset, it's literally a mindset. It's how do you approach the work? How do you think about the room when you walk into it? How do you think about who's missing, not who's there? How do you think about what is the end goal and how am I going to make sure diversions and distractions don't detour me? So again, it's about intentionality. And I won't say, Pam, I don't know what you're good or you're bad at. I don't think I can get great at something I'm bad at. I think I can get good at something I'm okay at. I think I can get pretty darn good at something I'm average at. So it's every one of these things is about how can we sort of move ourselves along that continuum to be stronger in those things. I think role models absolutely always matter. I think there's particular traits that I saw in each of those people. I just gave you one or two sort of off the top of my head without taking over the rest of the conversation. And Pam, if you, my email to everybody is shoe@paulshoemaker.org. If you want to send me a side note, I'll give you a few more ideas to answer that question, but that's just a couple sort of initial thoughts.
Well,
Great question.
I should have started by saying I agree with what your 5 qualities are.
Thank you.
I'm involved with women's politics, and I know how important leadership and authenticity and all that stuff really is. So I agree with you.
And it matters more now than it's ever mattered.
I just know that you can't, there's certain things you really can't teach somebody. A lot of things you can, you know.
Yep.
Like you said, it's like a muscle. Maybe you can improve it.
And hey, by the way, we can disagree too.
Okay, so we're opening this up to questions. So take yourself off mute, raise your hand. Would love to hear what questions you have for Paul. And I thank you, Paul, for the correction on your email address. So it's
Elisa, thanks for getting my email address right. I appreciate that, Elisa.
Leave it to me to do it wrong. This is, I'm just not even going to try anymore. Elisa's got it always. So
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, so questions. While you're all thinking, oh, I saw Sandra take herself off mute. So Sandra.
I figured I'd bite. So in the beginning, Paul, you were mentioning just the sort of disparate disconnect we have just politically in our world right now. And I was just wondering if you address a possible solution to mending that moving forward. I know it's a huge thing to ask.
It is huge. Let me answer that in 2 parts, Sandra. First of all, I sort of state in the book, I'm trying not to write a political book. Not because I don't care about it, but I was also trying to stick to stuff that I knew something about. And I don't consider myself a political expert. Having said that, what I think about the challenge you're just describing, it's like a lot of social problems we have. We have this new one called a divided, siloed America. Pretty damn huge fundamental one. And every one of us is absolutely guilty at some point in time of contributing to that. A little bit of some or a lot. So the first thing I'd say about it is, like the social challenges we face and we work on in Tucson and Seattle, the first choice we have to make is we're either going to quit and bag it, or else we're going to say we're going to keep working on this. So I think some people have said, I've given up on a siloed America. If everybody does that, then we're in a heap of trouble. We're already in some trouble. So I think we got to be intentional about not giving up on it. The second thing I'll say is I didn't sort of like position them this way in this book, but the 2 things that Pam asked about authenticity and generosity, I think those 2 traits literally respond as directly to that as anything I possibly could sort of put in front of you. The authenticity thing is about people. It's like this relentless, persistent, never quitting commitment to honesty, integrity, and personal accountability. It's relentless. You've got to constantly think that way. Right now, we have this problem of not just arguing about facts, but what are the facts? I think the only chance we've got is for enough people to sort of keep showing up with authenticity again and again and again, that we sort of drive our collective societies back to that. Way easier said than done, but I think that trait matters. And the generosity mindset one, it also matters. It is so easy right now to go into a room and play a zero-sum game or to think of the world in a zero-sum way. All you have to do is turn on the TV 24/7, flip a channel, and you will have plenty of reasons to hate somebody else, right? Or go onto the right social media channel and you will find a reason to hate somebody else. So again, there's an intention here about how are we going to show up in the world. I'm not saying I can build bridges with everybody. The people I want to try to build bridges with are not the ones that I know the best. Or maybe not even the ones that are just completely on the other side of the world from me, literally or politically. it's those people sort of in between there. I want to try to build bridges with them. I've got to bring a generosity mindset and try to sort of expand my circle of colleagues, friends, etc. And if enough of us do that, then we do sort of, grow the generosity of the world again. The problem you're pointing to is insanely hard. It's incredibly complex. And we have these technology and media forces driving us apart all the time, even more. So the only possible answer to it is human beings that decide they want to intentionally not let that take over, and that we're going to show up with authenticity and we're going to show up with generosity. Way easier said than done. I do think there's a roadmap. It's not particularly smooth and clear and obvious, but there is a roadmap out there that some of us can be on that can help us begin to bridge those silos and sort of decrease those divisions. That's a juicy question. Thanks for asking.
I appreciate the answer. It's a good answer. I've been
Yep.
kind of down a rabbit hole with Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Righteous Mind. And I think that's the one variable he didn't consider, because he really builds the map of how we got to this place, which has been building for decades.
Yep.
But drop in social media, right? And everything just kind of, so thank you for the thoughtful answer. I really appreciate
I don't know that anybody thought about that factor, man. 10 years ago to where we are now, holy smokes, it's a different world.
So we've had 2 questions come in the chat bar. So Peggy had asked, how do you think the younger generations are going to impact philanthropy in the future, and how can we guide them?
You want to take that one, or you want me to?
Well, why don't you kick us off?
I think they're going to change it a lot. And I actually feel this not just by their own philanthropy. I think the way they're going to impact philanthropy is inside their companies more than anywhere else. So we talked earlier about a little bit of cross-sector fluency. In 2020, we saw a lot more corporate leaders and CEOs show up in ways they never had to before. They're continuing to do that. Part of the reason they're doing that is because they care about their community, whatever. Part of the reason is because they care about their bottom line. The number one reason they're doing it is because their people are telling them, you either do it or I'm out of here. So if companies want great talent, the generation coming out right now, they care about purpose more than any generation before it. We can argue with that, or we can say, Gen Zs, millennials, we don't like this or that about them. I am positive that is true. I was not thinking about this stuff when I was that age. So their ability to impact philanthropy, to me, is through the way they're impacting corporate and private sector behavior. And the private sector can move stuff in ways that the nonprofit and the public sector just can't. So if the private sector truly gets committed, like in homelessness in Seattle, we are not going to solve it without the private sector, period, end of story. And the reason they're going to come to the table is not just because they care about it, because their young people are pushing them to do that. You want to add anything to that answer?
No, I agree with you. I mean, as a mom of 2 young adult daughters, what I can say is that this generation is so value driven, and they don't compartmentalize these things, kind of to Paul's point. Like, it's just a core of who they are.
Yep.
That it needs to be in every aspect of their life. I actually think your response, Paul, leads into a question from Steve. And I see you took yourself off mute, Steve, or maybe not. Maybe you're just blocked on my screen. Do you want to go ahead and ask that question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, Paul, and the work you're doing, you talk about cross-sector. And have you noticed a change in the last year or so with for-profit businesses being more amenable now to talking to philanthropy issues and social issues more than they have been in the past?
I assume it was partly a leading question. It's a great question. I'll give the answer. The answer to this question is hell yes. And let me answer it from a few sort of dimensions. One, I just said a minute ago. This is corporations at the end of the day, they're going to do whatever it takes to make more money than they spend. That's what they're driven to do, right?
Sure.
The great thing is now caring about social issues and causes affects their bottom line. It affects their brand. It affects their customers. And as I said a minute ago, more than anything, it affects the talent that they can acquire and develop and retain in their companies. So they are behaving differently because of that. Second thing I'll say is May 25th absolutely changed stuff. And some of that stuff's not going back. I just got done doing a project in the fourth quarter of this year, unrelated to SVP, is in a private consultant with a group in Oakland called Policy Link. They're an economic and human rights organization. The guy I mentioned for a second there a minute ago, Michael McAfee, he's their CEO. He is a force of nature. And the work I did in the fourth quarter, I talked to about 40 corporate CEOs. And the question was, where is corporate America at on racial equity? Because they wanted to get a sense of like, has the bell curve moved? Is the ball still rolling? And what I will tell you, obviously there's a little bit of bias in the answers they give me. But what I also asked for was for actions and policies and programs that backed it up. And the answer to that question is that corporate America absolutely cares more about racial equity than they did before. And in part because of bottom line reasons, in part because May 25th changed a lot of stuff for a lot of people. And we're not going back. I can't tell you necessarily where that's all going to end up. May 25th was not just a flash in the pan. It wasn't. It was a real damn thing. And it changed a lot of people. The word that I heard more on those 40 calls than I've ever heard before talking to CEOs was the word listen. Honest to God, the reason I called my first book Can't Not Do 6 years ago is because people kept saying that. If I was going to write a title to this report, which I don't own writing it, the title of that report would be CEOs have learned to listen, or learned to listen a lot better than they have before. So I think the answer is they absolutely have changed. They have, and are they more amenable to what's going on around them? They're more amenable to it, and they also have to be. And we could have an argument here about, the power of the private sector or not, and argue whether that's good or bad. That's a whole other conversation. In general, big problems are not going to get solved by one sector. So that's a good reason to have the private sector at the table. And the private sector, at the end of the day, they have more power, they have more clout than the other sectors do. They just do. So frankly, I probably won't always agree with them, but I think on the whole, it's much better having them at the table and having a voice than having them sort of staying in their own little silo. It's a great, deep, rich question.
Thank you.
So one of the things I have to do and perhaps have been too lax on is keep time. And we're just 3 minutes away from our end time. So Paul, I want to thank you, and I want to give you a chance to just share with our audience. I feel like there's so much that we can take away. And I actually want to say to everyone, I encourage you to read this book. We're going to put in the chat bar a link to the book. We're going to put in a link to the podcast. I started listening to that, and each session, Paul profiles a different leader, and you get to hear their stories. And one of the things I really appreciate that you do, Paul, is that you invite us to listen for leadership qualities differently. And I've really found that to be a nice place for me to pause and really listen to the story and understand where the leadership is coming from, because it does look different than the way we've looked at it. So to take us out, my question to you, Paul, if there's just one thing, and that's probably a hard question, but that you want all of us to walk away with from this hour with you, what would it be? What note do you want to leave us on?
Thank you. What I spent a lot of time painting the picture of was inequities that are, I think, more severe than I thought they were, that are on a more negative trajectory than I thought they were. We have laid on top of inequity complexities like we haven't seen in a long, long time. So I think the decade ahead is as challenging as any as we have faced, and it is as complex and as inequitable as anything America's seen in nearly 100 years. That's a little bit of hyperbole. I also totally believe it. The place where I came up with the metaphor in the book about rebuilders, and that's what I call these leaders, was because we're going to need leaders with that mindset. And we also need people that are going to think like rebuilders. I used it as a metaphor because of bridges in America. I'm sort of fascinated by how bridges work. As a little kid, I would spend time hanging out under a few bridges in this woods behind my house. And if you look at the state of bridges in America, they're in a state of disrepair. Many of them are in need of urgent rebuilding. So when I say rebuilders, if people can walk out of this with a mindset of rebuilding, bridges and American civil society, they are as strong as their underlying foundation, right? They're as weak as their underlying foundation. So we have to work at that level. We have a fundamentally different America than we did 20, even 10 years ago. And I think the mindset of thinking about rebuilding America is really critical. It's really vital. It's the intention that each of us needs to have. But I want to leave it on a hopeful note. So one of the comments I make in the book is I am worried about America in the dark of the night, and I'm fundamentally optimistic in the light of the day. It's the most fractured, siloed America we've seen in a long, long time. We have to get this right for America, for the world, and for cities like Tucson. And very sincerely, I think people like SVP Partners, you have shown up to be about philanthropy. You are now about something bigger than just philanthropy. You're about your community. You're about social change. You're about rebuilding America. You're about rebuilding Tucson. So sort of be determined and be realistic, but also don't lose that optimism and that commitment and that determination to want to try to make Tucson and Arizona and America a better place. It's absolutely doable. It's going to be the hardest challenge we face as a country in decades. So I just want to leave people with reality and determination and optimism that we can do this.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end this on. So I will just ask all of you to join me in thanking Paul for being here with us. Paul, it's an honor to share time and space with you always. And I hope you will come to Tucson physically and join us for an event in the future once it's safe to do so.
I'll be back in about December.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.